The whispers followed Abigail Varley like shadows on a summer evening as she made her way down the dusty main street of Bismarck, North Dakota, in the spring of 1882. She kept her head high despite the weight of their words, barren, worthless, half a woman pressing against her back with each step she took toward the general store. "Good morning, Mrs. Varley," Mr. Perkins said from behind the counter, his voice carrying the same pity that everyone's did these days. "What can I help you with? Just some flour and sugar, please." Abigail placed her basket on the counter and tried to ignore the two women whispering by the fabric section. 3 years of marriage to Thomas Varley, and not a single child to show for it. In a frontier town where families were everything, her empty womb was the subject of endless speculation. "Did you hear?" one of the women said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Dr. Simmons told Clara that there's no chance of Mrs. Varley ever bearing a child. Something wrong with her insides," he said. Heat flushed Abigail's cheeks. The doctor had promised discretion after her last examination. She gripped the counter edge until her knuckles whitened. "Poor Thomas," the other woman replied. "All that good farmland and no sons to pass it to." Abigail paid for her goods with trembling hands and hurried outside, nearly colliding with a tall figure at the door. "Pardon me, madam," said a deep voice that made her look up. The man before her stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin. His clothes were trail-worn dusty boots, faded denim, and a cotton shirt that had seen better days. A cowboy hat sat atop dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. But it was his eyes that captured her, storm cloud gray and direct in their gaze. "My fault entirely," she murmured, stepping aside. He tipped his hat and continued into the store, while Abigail hurried home, unaware that her life had just brushed against the man who would change everything. The Varley farm sat 2 miles outside of town. A modest homestead with a 2-room cabin, a small barn, and 40 acres that Thomas worked from dawn till dusk. As Abigail approached, she could see her husband in the fields, his back bent over the plow as he prepared the spring soil for planting. She entered their cabin and set her basket on the table, fighting back tears. She and Thomas had been childhood sweethearts back in Ohio. He'd promised her the world when they married, and she'd promised him children. Now, at 25, her failure hung between them like an uninvited guest. The sound of hoofbeats drew her to the window. A rider approached the cowboy from town. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle and tied his horse to the hitching post. Thomas straightened from his work and walked over to greet the stranger. Abigail watched as they spoke, her husband gesturing toward the barn and the fields beyond. The cowboy nodded, then extended his hand. Even from a distance, she could see the smile that transformed his weathered face. When Thomas led the man toward the house, Abigail quickly wiped her eyes and smoothed her apron. "Abby," Thomas called as they entered, "this is Kieran Lawson, just rode in from Montana. He's looking for work and I've hired him to help with spring planting." "Madam." Kieran removed his hat, revealing hair the color of rich coffee beans. "Hope it's no trouble." "No trouble at all," she replied, noting the lines at the corners of his eyes, laugh lines, perhaps, though his expression remained serious. "Will you be staying in town, Mr. Lawson?" "Kieran, please." "And Thomas offered your barn loft, if that sits well with you." Before she could answer, Thomas said, "We've got plenty of space, and it'll be good having help close by. The Andersons' eldest boys have gone east to school, and I can't manage the planting alone." Abigail nodded, recognizing the practicality of the arrangement. "I'll prepare the loft after supper." Kieran insisted on helping with the evening chores before eating. At the table, Abigail learned he'd been drifting since the end of the war, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana before deciding to head east. "What brings you to Dakota Territory?" she asked, passing him a plate of biscuits. "Heard there was work for those willing to put their backs into it," he replied. "And I've had my fill of Texas dust storms and Montana winters." Thomas laughed. "Well, you haven't escaped winter here, just missed it by a few weeks." After supper, Abigail prepared the loft while the men discussed the next day's work. She laid out clean blankets and a pillow, then added a small jar of wildflowers she'd collected the previous day. A small gesture of welcome. As she descended the ladder, she heard Thomas mention her name. "Abigail's the best cook in the county," her husband was saying. "You're lucky to taste her cooking while you're here." "Seems I am," Kieran replied, his voice carrying up to her. "You've got a fine place here, Thomas. A man could envy you." The words should have warmed her, but instead they stung. A fine place, yes. A fine wife, perhaps, but no children. No future. The next morning, Abigail rose before dawn to prepare breakfast. She was stirring a pot of oatmeal when Kieran entered, already dressed for work. "Hope I'm not intruding," he said, lingering by the door. "Not at all. Coffee's hot if you'd like some." He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching her work. "Thank you for the flowers," he said after a moment. "Been a long while since I've had such a thoughtful welcome." Something in his tone made her look up. There was a vulnerability there that didn't match his rugged appearance. "You've been traveling a long time. Too long, maybe." He took a sip of coffee. "A man starts to forget what it's like to belong somewhere." Before she could respond, Thomas came in and the moment passed. The men headed out after breakfast, and Abigail turned to her own chores: laundry, bread making, tending the kitchen garden. By midday, when she brought lunch to the fields, she found them working side by side, turning the earth for planting. Days stretched into weeks as spring blossomed across the prairie. Kieran proved to be a tireless worker, up before dawn and often continuing after Thomas had retired for the evening. Slowly, the 40 acres were plowed and sown with wheat, corn, and vegetables. In town, Abigail noticed the curious glances when she mentioned their hired hand. Mrs. Peterson at the mercantile raised her eyebrows. "That drifter." "Clara Anderson says he fought for the Union, has a bullet scar to prove it. But Martha Wilson heard he killed a man in Wyoming." "He's been nothing but respectful," Abigail defended, uncomfortable with the gossip. "Well, of course, dear. I'm just saying a woman can't be too careful with strangers." But Kieran didn't feel like a stranger anymore. He'd become a quiet presence in their lives, sharing meals, helping with repairs to the barn and cabin, and sometimes sitting with them in the evening while Thomas read from the Bible. He rarely spoke of his past, though occasionally a comment would reveal glimpses of childhood in Pennsylvania, a brother lost at Gettysburg, years spent moving from one ranch to another. One evening, as Abigail prepared supper, she overheard Thomas and Kieran talking outside the open window. "You should consider putting down roots," Thomas was saying. "Man your age should have a family." Kieran's laugh held no humor. "Some men aren't meant for that life." "Nonsense, you just haven't found the right woman, maybe." There was a pause. "Or maybe the right woman wouldn't want a man like me." Abigail's hand stilled on the dough she was kneading. There was such loneliness in those words. Later that night, lying beside Thomas in their bed, she asked, "Do you think Kieran will stay on after the harvest?" Thomas sighed. "I hope so. He's a good worker, but men like that rarely stay in one place long. He seems sad sometimes. War changes a man." Thomas rolled toward her, his hand finding her waist. "I was lucky. Came home to you before I saw the worst of it." His lips found hers, and for a while, Abigail lost herself in her husband's embrace. But afterward, as Thomas slept beside her, She stared at the ceiling, wondering why she'd thought of storm-gray eyes. The next morning brought news that shattered their quiet routine. A neighbor rode up as they finished breakfast, his face grim. "Thomas, there's been an accident. Your brother's place up near the Missouri." James Varley's homestead was a half-day's ride north. He'd written the previous month about a difficult calving season but had said nothing about trouble. "What happened?" Thomas demanded. "Barn fire. James was trapped inside." The neighbor removed his hat. "I'm sorry, Thomas," by the time they got to him. Abigail gasped, reaching for her husband's arm as he staggered slightly. "Sarah, the children?" Thomas asked, his voice hollow. "All safe, but Sarah's beside herself. James left her with 3 young ones in a homestead she can't manage alone." Thomas nodded, his expression hardening into resolve. "I'll go to them, today." "I'll come with you," Kieran said, already standing, but Thomas shook his head. "I need you here. The corn needs thinning, and there's the north fence to mend." He turned to Abigail. "I may be gone several weeks, perhaps longer. James would want me to see his family settled." Within the hour, Thomas had packed and saddled his horse. As he embraced Abigail, he whispered, "I trust Kieran to look after things, but be careful all the same. Town's not far if you need help." Then he was gone, riding north with their neighbor, leaving Abigail and Kieran standing in awkward silence. "I'll get to that north fence," Kieran said finally, turning toward the barn. "Mr. Lawson, Kieran," she called after him. "I'd appreciate it if you'd take supper in the house. No sense in both of us eating alone." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "As you wish, Mrs. Varley." The first few days without Thomas stretched uncomfortably between them. Kieran worked from sunrise until well past sunset, taking his meals quickly before retreating to the barn. Abigail found herself oddly restless, watching from the window as he moved across the fields, his tall figure silhouetted against the endless Dakota sky. On the 4th day, a sudden spring storm blew in from the west, bringing driving rain that pounded against the cabin roof. Abigail was struggling to secure the shutters when Kieran appeared beside her, soaked to the skin. "Let me," he said, reaching past her to latch the window. "You should get inside." "You're drenched," she replied, noting how his shirt clung to his broad shoulders. "Come in and dry by the fire." "I'll not have you catching your death." He hesitated, then followed her inside. Abigail handed him a towel and busied herself making coffee while he removed his boots and outer shirt, leaving him in trousers and a thin undershirt that revealed the powerful lines of his body. "The livestock?" she asked, keeping her eyes on the coffee pot. "Safe in the barn. Storm shouldn't last more than a few hours." She poured 2 cups and joined him by the fire. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters and driving rain against the walls. "Thank you," she said after a moment of silence. He looked up, puzzled. For what? Staying when Thomas left. Most hired hands would have seen it as an opportunity to move on. Kieran stared into his coffee cup. "I gave my word. Still, it's a comfort not being alone." Something flickered across his face, a flash of emotion quickly suppressed. "I imagine it is." Thunder crashed outside, making Abigail jump slightly. Kieran's hand moved as if to reach for her, then withdrew. "You have family back east?" he asked, changing the subject. "My parents died when I was 16. Fever. Thomas is all the family I have now." She bit her lip, remembering the whispers in town. Thomas wanted a large family, children to help with the farm, to carry on after we're gone. "And you? What do you want?" The question startled her. No one had asked her that in years. "I wanted to give him children," she admitted softly, "but it seems I can't." Kieran's eyes met hers, and there was no pity there, only a steady warmth. "There are many ways to build a family, Abigail." The use of her given name sent a ripple of awareness through her. "What do you mean?" "I grew up with 6 brothers and sisters. but the man who taught me most about life, about being a man, wasn't kin at all. He was a cavalry sergeant who found me half-starved after my regiment was cut to pieces at Cold Harbor, took me under his wing, showed me how to survive. Kieran's voice softened. Family isn't always blood. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something shifted between them. Abigail found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Ohio, of the books she loved, of dreams she'd put aside when she married Thomas. Kieran spoke of his years on the trail, of sunset over the Montana mountains, of the peace he found under star-filled skies. By the time the storm passed, leaving puddles in the yard and a fresh, washed smell in the air, Abigail felt as though she'd glimpsed the man behind Kieran Lawson's quiet exterior. That night, alone in her bed, she tried not to think about the way his eyes had lingered on her face when they said goodnight, or how something in her chest had tightened when he smiled, a real smile that transformed his solemn features. These thoughts had no place in her heart. She was a married woman, and Kieran was an employee, a drifter who would eventually move on. But in the days that followed, a new ease developed between them. They worked side by side in the kitchen garden, ate their meals together, and sometimes sat on the porch in the evenings, watching fireflies emerge as darkness fell. Kieran taught her to play checkers, laughing at her competitive spirit, while she encouraged him to read from the few books they owned. A letter arrived from Thomas after 2 weeks, explaining that Sarah needed more help than expected. Her oldest child was only 7, too young for much farm work, and the baby had taken ill. He would stay another month at least. Abigail read the letter aloud to Kieran as they sat at the supper table. He says James left significant debts. The farm may have to be sold. Hard situation, Kieran commented. Thomas is a good brother to stay. Yes. Abigail folded the letter carefully. It's what I admire most about him, his sense of duty to family. Kieran studied her face. You miss him. It wasn't quite a question, and Abigail found herself considering it honestly. I miss the certainty of knowing my place when he's here, she said finally. Everything is clearer with Thomas. Something flashed in Kieran's eyes, understanding perhaps, or something deeper. And without him, she looked away, unable to name the feelings that had been growing inside her. It's different. The following Saturday, Abigail needed supplies from town. Kieran insisted on accompanying her, concerned about her making the journey alone, though it was a trip she'd made countless times. As they rode into Bismarck, Abigail was acutely aware of the glances they received. A woman traveling with a man not her husband sparked immediate interest, especially when that woman was known to be Barren, and that man was a handsome stranger. Mrs. Varley, Reverend Phillips, greeted them outside the church. We've missed you at Sunday service. And this must be the hired hand I've heard about. Kieran Lawson, sir. Kieran dismounted and helped Abigail down from her wagon. Mrs. Varley has been kind enough to employ me while her husband is away. The minister's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes assessed them carefully. I trust all is well at the farm. Very well, thank you, Abigail replied, straightening her bonnet. We're just here for supplies. At the general store, the whispers followed them. Abigail tried to ignore them as she selected flour, coffee, and other necessities, but she could feel the weight of judgment pressing down. Mrs. Peterson approached as Kieran carried their purchases to the wagon. My dear, people are talking, she murmured. A woman alone with a drifter. It doesn't look proper. Mr. Lawson is a respectable employee, Abigail replied, her voice tight, and I am a respectable wife. The older woman patted her arm. Of course, dear, but a barren woman must be especially careful of her reputation. Men have needs that sometimes lead them astray when there are no children to consider. Humiliation burned through Abigail. "Excuse me," she said stiffly, turning away before tears could form. Outside, Kieran waited by the wagon, his expression darkening when he saw her face. "What happened?" "Nothing." "Let's go home." They rode in silence for several minutes before Kieran spoke. "They were cruel to you, I could see it." Abigail stared at the road ahead. "People talk. It's what they do in small towns. About you not having children." It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to look at him. "A woman's purpose is to bear children. Without that—" "That's horse shit," Kieran said with sudden vehemence. Abigail gasped at the profanity, finally turning to face him. "I apologize for the language," he continued, his gray eyes intense, "but not for the sentiment. A woman's worth isn't measured by the children she bears any more than a man's is measured by the acres he owns. The Bible also says to love your neighbor and judge not, but those fine Christian ladies in town seem to have overlooked those passages." He shook his head. "I've known women who have birthed a dozen children and treated them all like burdens. And I've known childless women who have nurtured every soul they've encountered." Something about his fierce defense broke through Abigail's carefully constructed walls. Tears spilled down her cheeks, tears she'd been holding back for years. Kieran stopped the wagon and awkwardly offered his handkerchief. "I'm sorry. I spoke out of turn." "No," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "No one's ever defended me like that before." Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, Abigail felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them on that dusty Dakota road. Then Kieran looked away, clicking the reins to start the horses moving again. "We should get back," he said, his voice rough. Storm clouds coming from the west. That night, Abigail lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, replaying the moment in the wagon over and over. The way Kieran had looked at her as though he truly saw her, not as Thomas's barren wife, but as a woman of value in her own right, had awakened something inside her, something dangerous and thrilling. The next morning, she found Kieran already at work in the fields. She brought him coffee and watched as he methodically checked the young corn stalks. "About yesterday," she began. "I overstepped," he interrupted. "Won't happen again." "That's not," Abigail took a deep breath. "I wanted to thank you for seeing me as more than my failure." Kieran straightened, his expression serious. "Abigail, listen to me. You haven't failed at anything. Sometimes life doesn't give us what we expect, but that doesn't make us failures. You sound like you speak from experience." A shadow crossed his face. "I wanted to be a doctor once. Had books, was saving for school. Then the war came." He looked out across the fields. "After I couldn't. The things I'd seen done, couldn't imagine healing anyone, so I drifted, took work where I could find it. And now," his eyes returned to her face, "now I'm here." The simple statement held a weight she couldn't fully understand, but something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. As May turned to June, the crops flourished under their care. Thomas wrote that he would return by mid-July. James's farm had been sold to pay debts, and Sarah and her children would move east to live with her sister. Abigail received the news with mixed emotions. She missed her husband, yet the thought of Kieran leaving when Thomas returned created an ache in her chest she couldn't explain away. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Kieran asked, "What will you do when Thomas returns?" "Do the same as always, I suppose. Keep house, help with the harvest." "And when I leave?" The question hung in the warm evening air. Abigail stared at her hands. "Will you leave?" "I'm a hired hand, Abigail, not family." "Where would you go?" Kieran shrugged, his profile outlined against the darkening sky. "California, maybe. Never seen the ocean." "Do you ever tire of it, the constant moving?" "Sometimes." His voice softened, more lately than before. Abigail wanted to ask why, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she said, "I've never seen the ocean either. Thomas promised we'd visit the Great Lakes someday, but there's always been too much work. You should see it." Kieran turned to her, his expression earnest. "You should see all of it, mountains so high they touch the clouds, forests where the trees block out the sun, deserts that stretch for days in every direction. You make it sound magical. It is." His hand moved slightly as if he might reach for hers, then withdrew. "You deserve to see it all, Abigail." The way he said her name like a prayer, like a promise, sent warmth cascading through her. "Perhaps someday." They sat in companionable silence as stars emerged overhead, neither acknowledging the current that ran between them, stronger with each passing day. The 4th of July brought Bismarck's annual celebration, a parade, picnic, and dance that drew folks from miles around. Thomas was still away, but Abigail felt obligated to attend, representing their farm. "You shouldn't go alone," Kieran said when she mentioned it. "I'll drive you." "People will talk even more," she warned. "Let them." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Better that than you facing their judgment alone." The celebration was in full swing when they arrived. American flags decorated the town square. Children ran laughing between food-laden tables, and a small band played patriotic tunes. Abigail felt eyes follow them as they made their way through the crowd, but Kieran's steady presence beside her bolstered her courage. She had just delivered her berry pies to the dessert table when Clara Anderson approached, her husband Frank in tow. "Abigail, we've missed seeing you in town." Clara's eyes darted to Kieran. "And this must be your helper." "Kieran Lawson, madam." He tipped his hat politely. Frank Anderson extended his hand. "Good to meet you, Lawson. Thomas wrote that you've been a godsend with the planting." "Thomas wrote to you?" Abigail asked, surprised. "Just checking in. Wanted to make sure everything was running smooth in his absence." Frank's tone was casual, but there was something in his expression that made Abigail's stomach tighten. "Everything is fine," she assured him. "The crops are thriving, and Kieran has been invaluable." "I'm sure he has," Clara said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Such a blessing to have a strong man around when one is alone." The implication in her words hung in the air between them. Abigail felt her cheeks flush, but before she could respond, Kieran spoke. "Mrs. Varley has managed admirably. Her husband would be proud of how she's kept the farm running." His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Frank cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, we should mingle. Enjoy the celebration, Abigail." As they walked away, Abigail released a shaky breath. "Thank you." Kieran's expression was grim. "They've been watching the farm, it seems so." "Thomas must have asked them to check on me. He cares for your safety. That's natural." But they both knew it was more than that. Thomas had set a watchdog on his Barren wife and the drifter working their land. The day progressed, with Abigail greeting neighbors and sharing news while Kieran remained a constant shadow. As evening approached, lanterns were lit, and the band switched to dance tunes. "Would you like to leave?" Kieran asked as couples began to gather for a Virginia reel. Abigail watched the dancers, suddenly weary of pretending. "No," she decided, "I'd like to dance." Surprise flickered across his face. "Are you sure?" "Yes." She met his gaze directly. "I'm tired of caring what they think." Kieran offered his arm and she took it, allowing him to lead her into the set forming for the next dance. Whispers followed them, but for once, Abigail didn't care. The music started and they moved through the steps of the dance forward and back. "Turn your partner, promenade." Kieran danced well, his large frame surprisingly graceful. When his hand clasped hers, when they circled each other with eyes locked, Abigail felt something bloom inside her, something dangerous and beautiful. As the evening progressed, they danced again and again, each time returning to each other as naturally as breathing. By the time the final song played a slow waltz beneath the stars, Abigail had forgotten everyone else. There was only Kieran's hand at her waist, his eyes on hers, and the music carrying them across the square. "We should go," he said when the music ended, his voice husky. "It's late." The ride home was silent, filled with unspoken words. When they reached the farm, Kieran helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment too long. "Thank you for the dances," she said softly. "Abigail." Her name was a whisper on his lips. He stood so close she could feel the warmth of him in the night air. "I should go to the barn." "Yes." But neither of them moved. His hand rose, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Good night," he said, then turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the yard with her heart pounding against her ribs. Inside the cabin, Abigail pressed her hands to her heated cheeks. What was happening to her? She was a married woman, yet here she stood, trembling from the mere touch of another man's hand. It was wrong, sinful, and yet when Kieran looked at her, she felt truly seen for the first time in years. Not as Thomas's barren wife, not as a failure, but as a woman with dreams and desires of her own. The next morning, Abigail rose early, determined to put proper distance between herself and Kieran. She was frying bacon when he entered the kitchen, hat in hand. "Morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Good morning. Breakfast will be ready soon." They moved around each other with deliberate space between them, like dancers following invisible boundaries. As they ate, Kieran outlined his plans for the day, mending the chicken coop, checking on the corn, cutting hay in the north field. "I'll bring lunch out to you," Abigail said, keeping her eyes on her plate. "No need. I'll come back to the house." She nodded, relieved and disappointed all at once. But by mid-morning, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon. The temperature dropped rapidly, and a strange greenish light filtered through the gathering storm. Abigail stood on the porch, watching with growing alarm as the sky darkened and a roaring sound grew in the distance. "Kieran." She called, scanning the fields frantically. Where was he? Then he was there, running toward the house. "Tornado," he shouted. "Get to the root cellar." Abigail grabbed the lantern and matches she kept by the door and raced toward the small earthen cellar behind the house. Kieran was right behind her, pulling the heavy wooden doors open and ushering her inside. They descended the dirt steps into the cool darkness as the wind howled above them. Kieran secured the doors from inside and took the lantern, lighting it with steady hands despite the chaos outside. The small space was lined with shelves of preserves and root vegetables, with barely enough room for two people to stand comfortably. Abigail pressed herself against the far wall as the roaring grew louder. "It's close," Kieran said, placing the lantern on a shelf. "But we're safe here." The cellar shuddered as the tornado passed nearby. Dirt sifted down from between the wooden slats above. Abigail gasped as a particularly violent gust seemed to pull at the doors. Kieran moved beside her, instinctively putting his arm around her shoulders. "It's all right," he murmured. "I've got you." She turned into his embrace, pressing her face against his chest as the storm raged. His heartbeat was strong and steady beneath her ear, his arms secure around her. For several minutes they stood locked together while the world threatened to tear apart above them. Then gradually the roaring subsided. The pressure in the air eased. Kieran's arms loosened but didn't fully release her. "I think it's past," he said, his voice rumbling in his chest. Abigail knew she should step away, but she couldn't make herself move. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming for me." His hand moved to gently cup her cheek, tilting her face up to his. In the lantern light, his eyes were dark, filled with emotions she couldn't name. "I will always come for you," he said simply. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Abigail's breath caught as his gaze dropped to her lips. "Kieran," she breathed, not sure if it was a plea to stop or to continue. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head. His lips touched hers gently, questioningly, a whisper of contact that sent fire racing through her veins. For one heartbeat, too, she remained still. Then, with a soft sound of surrender, she rose on her toes, her hands sliding up to his shoulders as she returned the kiss. It began tentatively, but quickly deepened as years of loneliness and longing broke through the walls she'd built. Kieran's arms tightened around her, drawing her against the hard length of his body as his mouth moved over hers with increasing hunger. A crash from outside jolted them apart. Reality rushed back. She was kissing a man who wasn't her husband, in the root cellar of the farm Thomas had built for them. "Oh God," she gasped, stepping away from Kieran. "What are we doing?" Shame and desire warred on his face. "Abigail, no, we can't." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the small space. "This is wrong. I'm married. I know." He ran a hand through his hair, his expression tormented. "I never meant for this to happen. I should leave." "Leave?" Panic surged through her. "The farm, I'll find someone to help until Thomas returns. But I can't stay, not now." He moved toward the steps, reaching for the doors. "We should check the damage." Outside, they found the farm largely spared. The tornado had passed just east of them, tearing through an empty stretch of prairie. The chicken coop was damaged and a few fence posts were down, but the house and barn stood intact. They worked side by side in painful silence, securing what could be saved, avoiding each other's eyes. By nightfall, the immediate repairs were complete, but the atmosphere between them remained charged with unspoken words. At the door to the cabin, Abigail finally found her voice. "Will you really leave?" Kieran stood in the yard, his face half hidden in shadow. "It would be best." "For whom?" He looked up at that, his eyes meeting hers across the distance. "For everyone, Abigail, you know that. And if I asked you to stay," the question hung between them, dangerous in its implications. Kieran's hands clenched at his sides. "Don't," he said hoarsely. "Don't ask that of me." She nodded, blinking back tears. "Good night, then." Inside, she moved through her evening routine like a sleepwalker, banking the fire, washing her face, changing into her nightgown. But when she lay in bed, sleep eluded her. All she could think about was Kieran's kiss, the safety of his arms, the way he looked at her as if she were precious. Dawn found her still awake, her decision made. She rose, dressed, and went to the kitchen to start breakfast. When Kieran entered, she met his gaze directly. "I won't ask you to stay," she said, "but I won't ask you to leave either. The choice is yours." He studied her face, his expression unreadable. "And if I stay, then we forget what happened yesterday. We work together until Thomas returns, and then you decide what comes next." It wasn't what either of them wanted, but it was the only honorable path forward. Kieran nodded slowly. "I'll stay until the harvest," he agreed. "Thomas deserves that much." They settled into a new routine, careful never to be alone together more than necessary. They worked diligently, spoke politely, and pretended the current between them didn't exist. At night, they retreated to separate spaces, Abigail to the cabin, Kieran to the barn loft. But sometimes, when they thought the other wasn't looking, their eyes would meet across a field or table, and everything they couldn't say was there in that glance. A letter arrived from Thomas in early July. He would return within 2 weeks, bringing Sarah and her children to stay temporarily while arrangements were made for their journey east. Abigail read the news to Kieran with a steady voice, though her hands trembled slightly. "They'll need space," Kieran said. "I should move my things to the tool shed." "No," Abigail replied quickly. Thomas will expect to find you in the loft. Anything else would raise questions. He nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. Any change in their arrangement might reveal the shift in their relationship, not physical anymore, but emotional, a connection that had grown despite their best efforts to prevent it. The days passed with aching slowness. Abigail cleaned the cabin thoroughly, prepared the small second bedroom for Sarah and the children, and tried not to count the hours until Thomas's return would end the strange limbo she and Kieran inhabited. The night before Thomas was expected, Abigail found Kieran sitting on the porch steps, staring at the star-filled sky. "May I join you?" she asked. Keeping her voice low though there was no one to overhear, he nodded, moving slightly to make room. They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the chirp of crickets and the rustle of wind through the corn. "What will you do?" she finally asked. "After the harvest?" Kieran's profile was sharp against the darkness. "Move on, I suppose, what I've always done." "Where does it matter?" There was a hint of bitterness in his voice. "It matters to me." He turned to her then, his eyes reflecting starlight. "Abigail, I know. We agreed not to speak of it, but tomorrow Thomas returns and everything changes." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I just need to know you'll be all right." Kieran's laugh held no humor. "All right? No, I don't imagine I will be, but I'll survive." He hesitated, then added softly, "I survived before I met you. I'll survive after." The simple statement broke something inside her. "I wish don't." His hand covered hers briefly, then withdrew. "Wishing changes nothing. You're Thomas's wife. He's a good man who loves you, that's the reality. And us, was this real?" Kieran stood abruptly, moving to the porch railing. "Too real," he said, his back to her. "More real than anything I've known." Abigail rose and crossed to stand beside him. "I need you to know something. Whatever happens tomorrow or after meeting you, it changed me. You helped me see myself differently." He turned to her, his expression raw with emotion. "Abigail, the sound of hoofbeats in the distance silenced him. They both froze, then Kieran moved quickly to the steps, peering into the darkness. "Riders," he said. "More than one." Abigail joined him, straining to see. "Thomas isn't due until tomorrow. Stay here." Kieran went to the cabin door, returning moments later with Thomas's rifle. He checked it quickly, then moved into the yard. The riders approached slowly, 3 men, their features indistinct in the darkness. Abigail's heart pounded as they drew closer. Then one called out, a familiar voice that made her shoulders sag with relief. "Hello, the house. Abigail, Thomas." She called back. "Is that you?" The lead rider urged his horse forward, and Thomas's face emerged from the shadows. Behind him rode another man and a woman who must be Sarah. "We made better time than expected," Thomas called as he dismounted. "Hope we're not arriving too late." Kieran lowered the rifle as Thomas approached. The 2 men shook hands, Thomas clapping Kieran on the shoulder with obvious gratitude. "Farm looks good," he said, glancing around. "You've kept things running smooth." "Your wife deserves most of the credit," Kieran replied, his voice carefully neutral. Thomas turned to Abigail, who had descended the porch steps. He embraced her briefly, then gestured to the woman dismounting with help from the 3rd rider. "Abigail, this is Sarah. And that's her brother-in-law, Martin, who accompanied us from the Missouri." Sarah Varley was a slender woman with tired eyes and a tentative smile. "Thank you for taking us in," she said, extending her hand to Abigail. "Thomas has told me so much about you." "Welcome," Abigail replied, trying to focus on the moment rather than the man standing silently behind her husband. "Where are the children?" "Asleep in the wagon," Thomas explained. "We left it and most of our things at the Andersons' farm. Didn't want to arrive with too much commotion in the dark." Within the hour, Sarah's 3 children, Jacob, Emma, and baby William were settled in the second bedroom with their mother. Martin took his leave, promising to return the next day with the wagon, and Thomas sat at the kitchen table with Kieran, discussing the farm while Abigail prepared a late meal. It was surreal, watching the two men talk amicably while her heart felt torn in two. Thomas spoke of his time at James's farm, the difficulties of arranging the sale, and his plans for bringing in their own harvest. Kieran reported on the condition of the crops, the repairs made after the tornado, and the new calf born to their only milk cow. They could have been any farmer and his trusted hand, discussing the business of the land. No one looking at them would guess that Kieran had held Abigail in his arms, had kissed her with a passion that still burned in her memory. When the men finished eating, Thomas yawned widely. "Been a long journey. Think I'll turn in." He glanced at Kieran. "We can discuss the rest in the morning." Kieran nodded. "I'll head to the barn. Early start tomorrow." Abigail began clearing the dishes, keeping her eyes down as the men stood. When Kieran moved toward the door, Thomas stopped him. "Before you go, I want to thank you properly for looking after things. After the harvest, we should discuss you staying on permanently. Farm this size needs more than one man." Kieran's expression remained carefully blank. "That's generous, but I don't usually stay in one place long." "Think about it," Thomas urged. "You've proven yourself reliable, and Abigail seems comfortable with you here." At that, her hands stilled on the dishes. She could feel Kieran's eyes on her but couldn't bring herself to look up. "We'll talk more tomorrow," Thomas continued, oblivious to the tension. "Good night, Lawson. Good night." When the door closed behind Kieran, Thomas turned to Abigail with a tired smile. "Everything all right while I was gone? You seem different." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Just surprised by your early return, and having guests." He accepted this explanation and moved to embrace her. "I missed you, Abby." That night, as Thomas slept beside her, Abigail stared at the ceiling and wondered how she could possibly continue this charade. How could she be a proper wife to Thomas when her heart longed for another? How could she face Kieran day after day, knowing what might have been? The answer came with the dawn. She couldn't. One of them, she or Kieran, would have to leave. And since this was Thomas's farm, Thomas's life, it would have to be Kieran who went at breakfast. With Thomas occupied helping Sarah settle the children, Abigail managed a moment alone with Kieran in the barn. "You should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After the harvest." His eyes searched her face. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. This is Thomas's home. You and we made a mistake." Kieran's expression hardened. "A mistake? Is that what you call it?" "What else can I call it?" Her voice broke slightly. "I'm married, Kieran." "To a man you don't love." The words hung between them, dangerous in their truth. Abigail took a step back. "That's not fair. Thomas is a good husband. He deserves better than this." "And what do you deserve, Abigail?" Kieran moved closer, his voice dropping. "A lifetime of settling for good enough, of being valued only for the children you haven't given him." "Stop." She pressed her hands to her ears. "We can't do this." Kieran reached for her, his hands gently pulling hers away from her face. "Look at me," he said softly. "Just look at me and tell me you feel nothing, and I'll leave today." She raised her eyes to his, and the love she saw there nearly broke her. "I can't," she whispered. "You know I can't." A sound at the barn door made them spring apart. Thomas stood there, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. "Thomas," Abigail began, her heart in her throat. "We were just discussing the harvest," Kieran finished smoothly. "I was telling Mrs. Varley the wheat should be ready within 2 weeks." Thomas's eyes moved between them, and for a terrible moment, Abigail thought he had heard everything. Then he nodded slowly. "Good to know. Sarah's asking for you, Abby, something about helping with the children." "Of course." She hurried past him, unable to meet his eyes. For the next several days, tension simmered beneath the surface of the farm's routine. Thomas said nothing about what he might have seen or heard in the barn, but his gaze followed Abigail more closely than before. She threw herself into caring for Sarah's children, finding unexpected joy in teaching 7-year-old Jacob to read, showing 5-year-old Emma how to gather eggs without frightening the hens, and rocking baby William when he fussed in the night. Sarah, still grieving her husband's death, was grateful for the help. "You're so natural with them," she commented one afternoon as they hung laundry. "You would have made a wonderful mother." The words, meant as a compliment, stung. "Would have." Sarah's face flushed. "I'm sorry." Thomas mentioned, "That is, I assumed." "That I'm barren." Abigail's voice was sharper than intended. "It's not a secret, apparently." "I didn't mean to upset you." Sarah's eyes filled with compassion. "For what it's worth, I think there's more to being a mother than bearing children. You're mothering my 3 right now, and they adore you for it." The simple observation struck Abigail deeply. She looked across the yard where Jacob was helping Kieran repair the chicken coop, chattering non-stop while the man listened with evident patience. "Your hired man is good with children too," Sarah remarked, following her gaze. "Jacob hasn't stopped talking about him since we arrived." Abigail watched as Kieran showed the boy how to hold a hammer properly, his large hands gentle as they guided Jacob's smaller ones. Something twisted in her chest, longing, regret, possibilities that could never be. "Yes," she said softly. "He is." That evening, as they all sat around the supper table, Jacob announced, "Mr. Kieran's teaching me to be a carpenter. I'm helping fix everything." Thomas laughed. "Is that so? Well, we can always use another pair of hands around here, even small ones." "Mr. Kieran says I'm a natural," the boy continued proudly. "And he's teaching Emma too. He showed her how the baby birds in the barn need their mama to feed them, just like baby William needs mama." "You're spending quite a bit of time with the children," Thomas commented, glancing at Kieran. "Hope that's all right," Kieran replied. "They're good company." "It's more than all right," Sarah interjected. "It's the first time I've seen Jacob truly smile since his father died." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening, perhaps, or a realization. He studied Kieran thoughtfully, then turned his gaze to Abigail, who was helping Emma cut her meat. "You're good with them, Abby," he said quietly. "Both of you are." After supper, while Sarah put the children to bed, Thomas suggested Abigail join him for a walk. They strolled in silence to the edge of the wheat field, golden now in the evening light. "It's nearly ready," Thomas said, running his hand over the heavy grain heads. "Good crop this year." "Yes." Abigail watched a hawk circle lazily overhead, wondering why he'd brought her out here. "Abby." Thomas turned to her, his expression serious. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." Her heart skipped. "Of course. Are you in love with Kieran Lawson?" The direct question knocked the breath from her lungs. She opened her mouth, closed it, then simply stared at her husband of 3 years. "Thomas, the truth, Abby, please." She looked into the face of the man she'd known since childhood, the man who had promised to love and cherish her and couldn't bring herself to lie. "Yes," she whispered, "but I never meant for it to happen. Nothing improper has occurred." To her surprise, Thomas nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. "I know you too well to think you'd break your vows lightly, and Lawson's too honorable, despite what I feared when I first saw you together in the barn. You knew then, I suspected." He sighed, looking out across the fields. "The way you looked at each other, it wasn't hard to see." Shame washed over her. "Thomas, I'm so sorry. You've been nothing but good to me, and I've betrayed your trust." "Have you?" He turned back to her, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "You didn't ask for these feelings, And I haven't been as good to you as I should have been." "What do you mean?" "I've been so focused on what you couldn't give me children that I stopped seeing what you do give me every day. Your strength, your kindness, your determination to make this harsh land into a home." He reached for her hand. "When James died, leaving Sarah with 3 small children and no one to help her, it made me think about what really matters." Abigail struggled to understand. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that perhaps God has a different plan for us than the one we imagined." Thomas squeezed her hand. "Sarah needs help raising her children. They need a father figure, and you need something I can't give you." "Thomas, no, I made vows to you. Vows to love and honor each other." His smile was sad but genuine. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to let go." Abigail stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "You would release me from our marriage. It wouldn't be easy. There would be talk, judgment. But yes, if that's what would bring you happiness." He looked toward the house where a lamp burned in the window. "I've seen how you are with Sarah's children, how Lawson is with them too, the 4 of you together. It looks right in a way that you and I never quite have." Tears filled Abigail's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it, all of it, what you want, what Sarah and her children need, what future might be possible." "And you, what about your happiness?" Thomas's expression softened. "Seeing James's children thriving, helping Sarah rebuild her life, there's happiness in that too, Abby." They returned to the house in silence, each lost in thought. That night, Thomas slept in the barn, giving his explanation that Sarah's baby was colicky and everyone needed their rest. The next morning, Abigail found Kieran alone in the stable, saddling his horse. Her heart sank at the sight of his saddlebags already packed. "You're leaving," she said, her voice hollow. He turned, his expression guarded. "It's for the best. I spoke with Thomas this morning. He'll pay me through the harvest, but I won't be staying." "He told you to go?" "No." Kieran's hands stilled on the saddle. "He told me about your conversation last night, said the decision was yours, but that I should know where things stand." Hope and fear tangled in her chest. "And where do things stand, Kieran?" "With you." He crossed to her in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I love you, Abigail. I've loved you since that first day in the general store when you held your head high despite their cruel whispers." His thumbs stroked her cheeks gently. "But I won't be the man who breaks apart a marriage. I can't live with that, no matter how much I want you." "Thomas is offering to step aside," she whispered. "He sees what we feel for each other. He's willing to let me go. And you, what do you want?" The question hung between them, the same one he'd asked in the root cellar weeks ago. But this time, Abigail knew her answer with absolute certainty. "You," she said simply. "I want you, Kieran, a life with you." His kiss was different this time, not tentative or questioning, but sure and deep, filled with promise. Abigail wound her arms around his neck, surrendering to the joy that flooded through her. When they finally drew apart, breathless and smiling, she pressed her forehead to his. "Don't leave," she murmured. "Not yet. We need time to figure this out properly. Are you sure?" "There will be talk, judgment. Let them talk." She squared her shoulders. "I've lived under their judgment for years. I can bear it a while longer." The next few weeks passed in a strange, tense limbo as the 4 adults navigated their unconventional situation. Thomas moved permanently to the barn, explaining to curious neighbors that he was giving his sister-in-law and her children space in the cabin. Sarah, once she understood the shifting relationships, was surprisingly supportive. "Life is too short to deny love where it exists," she told Abigail as they picked beans in the garden. "James and I had 10 good years together. Not enough, but more than some get. If you found someone who looks at you the way Kieran does, you shouldn't let that go." The children adapted quickly, especially Jacob, who followed Kieran everywhere. Even little William, barely 6 months old, would calm immediately in the cowboy's strong arms. As July turned to August, the wheat ripened to gold under the Dakota sun. The harvest would begin soon, and decisions could no longer be postponed. One evening, Thomas called them all together after the children were asleep. "I've been corresponding with the Reverend," he began, his expression serious. "Divorce isn't common, but it can be arranged, especially given circumstances." "Thomas," Abigail started, but he raised a hand. "Let me finish. I've also been thinking about James's land. It's sold now, but there's another parcel nearby that's available. Smaller but good soil. I could start fresh there." "Alone?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed. Thomas glanced at her, something unspoken passing between them. "Not necessarily, but that's a conversation for another time." He turned back to Abigail and Kieran. "The point is, there's a way forward for all of us if you're willing to face the judgment that will come." Kieran's hand found Abigail's, his grip firm. "We are. Then it's settled. After the harvest, I'll speak with the Reverend again, make the arrangements official. In the meantime," Thomas's voice softened, "Abby, I think it's time you and Kieran announced your intentions to the town. Together." 2 days later, Abigail and Kieran rode into Bismarck, their backs straight despite the stares that followed them down the main street. They dressed in their best clothes, Abigail in her blue Sunday dress, Kieran in a clean shirt and vest, his boots polished to a shine. The general store fell silent as they entered, arm in arm. Mr. Perkins's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Mrs. Peterson dropped the bolt of fabric she was measuring. In the corner, Clara Anderson's mouth hung open in shock. "Good morning," Abigail said clearly, her voice carrying through the stunned silence. "Mr. Perkins, we need supplies for the harvest." The storekeeper cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Of course, Mrs. Varley, just make your list as usual." "Actually," Kieran said, his deep voice steady, "there's been a change. I'd like to open an account under the name Lawson, Kieran and Abigail Lawson." The shocked gasps that swept through the store might have been comical in another context. Mrs. Peterson pressed a hand to her chest as if she might faint. But you're married to Thomas Varley," she sputtered, staring at Abigail. "Arrangements have been made," Abigail replied calmly. "With Thomas's full knowledge and blessing, Reverend Phillips is handling the details." "This is scandalous," Clara Anderson declared, her face flushed with righteous indignation. "What about your vows? Your duty to your husband?" Kieran's arm tightened around Abigail's waist. "Mrs. Anderson, with all due respect, this is a private matter between Abigail, Thomas, and myself." "Private?" Clara's voice rose. "There's nothing private about flaunting your sin in front of the whole town. What's next? Will you move that drifter into Thomas's home, have him sleep in Thomas's bed?" "That's enough," came a firm voice from the doorway. Thomas stood there, hat in hand, his expression resolute. Beside him was Sarah, holding baby William while Jacob and Emma peered curiously around her skirts. "My wife and I have agreed to part ways," Thomas continued, moving to stand beside Abigail and Kieran. "It's an arrangement that brings peace to all concerned, and I'll thank you to respect our decision." "But she's barren," someone muttered from the back of the store. "What does he want with a woman who can't bear children?" It was Kieran who answered, his voice ringing with such conviction that even Clara Anderson fell silent. "They laughed at this barren bride until I said she'll feed every soul I love." He looked down at Abigail, his eyes filled with tenderness. "She already mothers Sarah's children as if they were her own. She nurtures every person she meets with kindness and strength. Her worth isn't in her womb, but in her heart." He turned back to the stunned onlookers. "I don't care if she never bears a child." She feeds my soul, and that's more than enough." In the profound silence that followed, little Jacob tugged at Kieran's trouser leg. "Mr. Kieran, does this mean you're going to be my new papa?" A ripple of surprised murmurs ran through the store. Kieran crouched down to the boy's level, his expression gentle. "Would you like that, Jacob?" The child nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. And Mama says we're all going to live together on the farm and you'll teach me everything about horses and wheat and building things." Kieran glanced up at Sarah, who smiled her confirmation. "That's the plan," he told Jacob. "If it's all right with you and your sister." "It's all right with me," Emma piped up from behind her mother's skirts. "And baby William too." A chuckle ran through the store, breaking some of the tension. Even Mrs. Peterson's severe expression softened at the children's innocent acceptance. Mr. Perkins cleared his throat. "Well then, I suppose I can open that account for you, Mr. Lawson, and congratulations, I think." As they left the store with their supplies, Abigail felt lighter than she had in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, there would be more judgment, more whispers, but for the first time she didn't care. "Are you all right?" Kieran asked as they loaded the wagon. She smiled up at him, squinting against the August sun. "Better than all right." The harvest came and went in a blur of activity. Working together, Thomas, Kieran, Abigail, Sarah, even Jacob with his small but eager hands, they brought in a crop more bountiful than any the farm had seen before. By September, the wheat was safely stored, and the arrangements Thomas had discussed were set in motion. Reverend Phillips, though clearly uncomfortable, processed the divorce with minimal fuss. Thomas purchased the smaller parcel of land he'd mentioned, and to everyone's surprise except perhaps Abigail's, Sarah and her children moved there with him. "We're not rushing into anything," Sarah explained when the children were out of earshot. "But there's something between us, a friendship that might become more, given time." In October of 1882, Abigail Varley became Abigail Lawson in a simple ceremony at the farm, with Thomas, Sarah, and the children as their only guests. Reverend Phillips declined to officiate, but a circuit judge passing through was willing to perform the legal duties. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," he declared, closing his book. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Lawson." Kieran's arms encircled Abigail, drawing her close as his lips met hers. Behind them, Jacob and Emma cheered while baby William gurgled happily in Sarah's arms. "Look around you," Kieran whispered when they parted. "This is our family. Unconventional, perhaps, but ours." Abigail gazed at the circle of faces, Thomas with his arm around Sarah's shoulders, Jacob bouncing with excitement, Emma twirling in her best dress, William reaching pudgy hands toward her. And Kieran, her husband at last, looking at her with love that took her breath away. "Our family," she agreed, her heart full. That winter was the happiest Abigail had ever known. The cabin, once a place of quiet desperation, now echoed with children's laughter. Jacob and Emma split their time between the two farms, bringing joy to both households. Baby William took his first steps on the kitchen floor Abigail had swept 1,000 times before. And at night, in the privacy of what had once been her marriage bed with Thomas, Kieran showed her what true passion could be between a man and woman deeply in love. By spring, the gossip in Bismarck had largely subsided, replaced by newer, more interesting scandals. When Abigail entered the general store, she no longer felt the weight of judgment pressing down. Some, like Mrs. Peterson, would never fully accept her choices, but others had softened their stance. "Your stepchildren look well," Clara Anderson commented one day, surprising Abigail with the absence of venom in her voice. "Jacob's reading has improved considerably since you started teaching him." "Thank you," Abigail replied cautiously. "He's a bright boy." Clara hesitated, then added, Frank says your husband's done wonders with that farm. Best wheat yield in the county last harvest. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was a start. In June of 1883, just as the wheat was beginning to head, Abigail made a discovery that sent her running to the fields where Kieran was checking the irrigation ditches. "Kieran," she called, her voice carrying across the green expanse. He straightened immediately, concern crossing his face as he saw her hurrying toward him. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she assured him as she reached his side, breathless and smiling. "Everything's right, so right." His brow furrowed in confusion. "Abigail." She took his hand and placed it gently against her abdomen. "I'm with child," she whispered. "Dr. Simmons confirmed it this morning." Kieran's expression transformed from confusion to wonder. "A baby, our baby." His voice cracked on the words. Abigail nodded, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Due in January, he thinks. I know we never expected, never dared hope." Kieran swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground in his excitement. "A miracle," he breathed against her hair. "Our miracle." That evening they shared the news with Sarah, Thomas, and the children. Jacob's eyes widened comically. "You mean I'm going to be a big brother again?" "In a way," Kieran laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "You'll certainly be the oldest child in our unusual family." "Will the baby call Uncle Thomas uncle or something else?" Emma asked, practical as always. The adults exchanged glances, and it was Thomas who answered. "I think Uncle works just fine. After all, we are family, aren't we? Not by blood, perhaps, but by choice." As summer ripened into fall, Abigail's body changed with the seasons. Her once flat stomach rounded, and a glow suffused her skin that had nothing to do with the harvest sun. Kieran watched her with a mixture of awe and protectiveness, insisting she rest more, eat better, let him handle the heavier chores. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she protested as he took the laundry basket from her hands. "Humor me," he replied, kissing her forehead. "I've waited my whole life for this family. Let me take care of you." In January of 1884, as a blizzard howled across the Dakota prairie, Abigail gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Sarah acted as midwife, having delivered 3 children of her own, while Kieran paced anxiously outside the bedroom door with Thomas and the children. When Sarah finally called him in, Kieran approached the bed with reverence. Abigail lay propped against the pillows, tired but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Meet your son," she said softly, pulling back the blanket to reveal a tiny face with a shock of dark hair. Kieran sat carefully beside her, his large hands gentle as she placed the newborn in his arms. "He's perfect," he whispered, a tear sliding down his weathered cheek. "Absolutely perfect." They named him James Thomas Lawson, honoring both Thomas's brother and Thomas himself. When the blizzard finally passed, Reverend Phillips came to the farm to baptize the child, his previous reservations seemingly forgotten as he blessed the newest member of their unconventional family. Spring brought new beginnings. Thomas and Sarah married in April, blending their families officially. The 2 farms thrived side by side, with Kieran and Thomas often working together during busy seasons. On a warm evening in May, as Kieran and Abigail sat on their porch watching 3-year-old William and 4-month-old James sleep in a shared cradle, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You ever regret it?" she asked, her head resting on Kieran's shoulder. "Taking on someone else's children, someone else's farm," Kieran's arm tightened around her. "Never, not for a single moment." He kissed the top of her head. "You know, when I first rode into Bismarck, I was just looking for temporary work, somewhere to rest before moving on, as I always had." "What changed?" "I saw you," he said simply, standing tall in that general store despite their whispers, And something in me recognized something in you, a loneliness, perhaps, or a hunger for more than what life had offered so far. Abigail smiled, remembering their first encounter. I thought you were just passing through. I was. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. But then I discovered that sometimes the journey leads you exactly where you're meant to be. From inside the house came the sound of Jacob calling for a glass of water. Abigail started to rise, but Kieran gently pressed her back. I'll go, he said. You rest. As she watched him disappear into the house, Abigail's hand drifted to her stomach, where the first flutters of their second child had recently made themselves known. Another baby to join their blended family, another soul for her to nurture. She thought of the cruel whispers that had once followed her through town, Barren, worthless, half a woman. How wrong they had been. Her worth had never been in her ability to bear children, but in her capacity to love them, to feed their bodies and souls with care and kindness. In the fading light, with crickets beginning their evening chorus and the scent of ripening wheat drifting from the fields, Abigail Lawson closed her eyes in gratitude. For the journey that had brought her here, for the man who had seen her true value, and for the family they had built together, a family bound not by convention or blood, but by choice and love, a family where every soul was fed.